From 1955 to 1968, many Americans across the country worked tirelessly trying to establish racial equality in the United States. These Americans organized what would become known as the Civil Rights Movement. Because of their race, African Americans were not allowed to enjoy the privileges that many whites took for granted, such as sitting in the front of a bus or voting. Civil rights activists sung inspirational songs such as "We Shall Overcome" to protest these injustices placed upon African Americans. Although lives were lost in the process, the civil rights movement was successful, and African Americans would eventually obtain the rights they had fought so hard for. In light of the victory of the civil rights movement, future activists would use similar protesting strategies in order to gain support for their cause and achieve their own goals. During the Vietnam War, for instance, anti-war advocates expressed their opinion through music as a way of protest. Although civil rights activists and anti-war activists wrote songs supporting their own causes, the anti-war songs had more of an effect on their respective movement. During the middle of the Vietnam War, a large number of English rock bands came to the United States in order to achieve fame and success. This period became known as the British Invasion, with rock groups heavily impacting the development of America's musical taste. In the 1950s, Americans listened to blues and jazz music, but from 1963 to even after the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, Americans became obsessed with rock musicians such as the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, as well as soulful and psychedelic American musicians such as Marvin Gaye and Jimi Hendrix. By combining innovative recording technology and their own unique imaginations, these musicians created impactful songs which drew global attention, especially of teenagers and college students. Because of the extreme popularity of the aforementioned musicians, bands such as the Beatles knew that they could utilize their songwriting abilities to make a difference in the world. With the U.S. military stationed in Vietnam, musicians wrote anti-war songs in order to get their fans to galvanize and protest against it. The renowned Beatles member, John Lennon, who was a devoted peace activist, teamed up with Paul McCartney in 1968 to write Revolution and released Imagine and Happy Christmas, War's Over in 1971. Lennon's lyrics came from his personal opinion, for example, writing that, quote, "When you talk about destruction, don't you know that you can count me out," end quote. Although this was not a direct message advocating protest against the war, it indirectly helped the anti-war movement's cause. Because John Lennon was one of the most influential songwriters of the time, he was able to convey his disdain for war, thereby influencing a generation of young people to react in defiance against the notions and realities of war. Lennon's songs were extremely popular. Revolution was a song on the White Album, which was number 1 on the charts for 9 weeks straight, platinum certified 19 times, and is currently 10th on the list of best-selling albums of all time. Imagine, meanwhile, is considered the 3rd best song of all time according to Rolling Stone magazine.
As a professional songwriter, I write songs to move people in a happy way, a sad way, a thoughtful way, a thought-provoking way, a funny way. And these writers during the times of these terrible wars were inspired to do something heavy, to make them move, or to make them stop, basically. So they were inspired to what was inside of them, and they moved a generation. People like Pete Seeger, Revolution by the Beatles, the Stones were doing it, Arlo Guthrie Jr. was doing it. I mean, and it will continue to go on for all time. When you're moved and you're passionate about something, music inspires better than a good speech. Because a good speech you hear once and then you get moved and you're like, oh yeah, but a song stays in your head. Say you want a revolution. You're going to sing that, and all of a sudden it's going to spur you on to, to remember it and to make a movement.
On the other hand, music of the civil rights movement did not have as much of a reach as music of the anti-war movement. Songs such as "We Shall Overcome" and "This Little Light of Mine" were primarily religious songs sung in churches and would eventually become popular only within the civil rights movement and its activists. Because these songs were not broadcasted nationwide or recorded by famous musicians, less people were able to listen to the song, thus limiting the amount of potential civil rights supporters. Music was the cohesive venue that united not only a generation of young adults, but connected races as well. Both white and African American teens appreciated Motown musicians with anti-war songs such as What's Going On by Marvin Gaye, and above all, Ball of Confusion, That's What the World Is Today by The Temptations. Ball of Confusion is a psychedelic soul song that referenced the problems inherent in the United States in the early 1970s. Not only did Ball of Confusion address issues such as racism, drug addiction, and politics, it directly attacked the Vietnam War with lyrics such as, quote, obligation to my nation, end quote, which implied that one had to serve in Vietnam, and, quote, people all over the world are shouting end the war, end quote. Because the song reached number 3 on the US pop charts and number 2 on the US R&B charts, it was influential to both white and African American listeners, as it related to the turmoil that affected everyone in the country at the time. Although African American musicians such as The Temptations wrote about racism and the Vietnam War, these musicians did not write about the civil rights movement. Songs such as What's Going On by Marvin Gaye, which was about civil rights as well as the Vietnam War, was originally rejected by Motown's founder Berry Gordy, who proceeded to ask Gaye, quote, why do you want to ruin your career, end quote. Gordy knew that, quote, all Motown artists went through a finishing school that taught them to carefully avoid controversial topics in their music, but Marvin Gaye was a rebel, and he wasn't about to back down now, end quote. The song would eventually be released in 1971, after the end of the civil rights movement, and would become the number 4 song of all time and on the number 6 album of all time, according to Rolling Stone magazine. As peaceful as the civil rights movement was, activists were still beaten and murdered while trying to achieve racial equality. Similarly, there was also bloodshed during the anti-war movement, specifically the Kent State Massacre in 1970. Nonviolent college students upset about the Vietnam War were protesting the American invasion of Cambodia when the Ohio National Guard opened fire on them, killing 4. The tragedy united 4 million students who went on a student strike on college campuses across the nation, protesting both the Vietnam War and the Ohio National Guard. As a tribute to the Kent State incident and as a protest against Nixon and the Vietnam War, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young wrote the song Ohio.
Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young's song Ohio not only was written in honor of the Kent State Massacre and in protest of the Vietnam War, but it also rallied students across the country on college campuses. And these were kids, 18 to 22-year-olds, and because the song had been played over and over and over on the radio, the thought of the massacre and the protest never left the minds of these young adults.
The group repeats the lines, 4 dead in Ohio and tin soldiers and Nixon's coming, to emphasize the horrific and outrageous act of violence that played out at Kent State. The song reminded listeners about the incident and continued to fuel the students' anger over the war, the president, and the National Guard. The massacre was reminiscent of Bloody Sunday, a televised incident during the civil rights movement where 600 activists were attacked by Alabama state troopers. Conversely, there were no songs written by any mainstream musicians about Bloody Sunday. The triumph of the civil rights movement demonstrated to anti-war activists that they could also voice their displeasure regarding the unpopular policies of the United States government, specifically concerning the Vietnam War. Although tactics used in the civil rights movement, such as sit-ins, proved to be useful for the activists in the anti-war movement, the one major difference between the two movements was the music relating to the causes. Music in the 1960s and 1970s had a much more profound effect on the anti-war movement in comparison to the music supporting the civil rights movement. Civil rights songs were religious in nature and mostly relevant to the people participating in the movement. Anti-war songs, meanwhile, were played on radios across the country by famous rock and roll musicians, therefore reaching a much larger scale of listeners and potential activists. With musicians of different races denouncing the evils of war, an even larger group of people around the country was influenced. The powerful lyrics speaking out against the Vietnam War persuaded millions of teenagers and young adults to protest against unpopular government policies. Although both the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement had similar methods of protest, the anti-war movement had more support because of the popular music against the Vietnam War that grasped the attention of many people across the United States.